This time I want to talk about then what do we do? How do we start to work in ways that are deliberate and organised in order to make a difference towards a more positive outcome, particularly given all those conditions we've talked about, which is we can't make change happen, we need to work with others, change is complex, change is interdependent, and so on. So going back to this notion that problems are complex, they're interdependent, they're wicked. Issues of poverty, inequality are everywhere. They're not things that are just happening in other countries. Power is an ongoing issue in terms of who holds the power to stop and change things. And again, going back to that notion that underpins the Sustainable Development Goals, which is that if we want to make a difference, we're all in this together. We actually have to understand how to work in solidarity and connection with a whole range of different actors and partners, particularly those who understand more about the local political, small p political realities, who can actually navigate those realities and make a difference in those situations. And you remember those three approaches we talked about last time, they all are dependent upon this notion that local actors know more about local reality, and we have to work out ways of working with them. Now, this is a really important notion that we're actually starting to move towards a whole range of relationships and ways of working. We need to find local brokers, people who can convene other groups and other people. And it moves us very much away from what's been a more traditional approach, which is this notion that's covered by the word partnership. Obviously, partnership can mean a whole range of things, but traditionally in a lot of aid and development work, partnership has been the term that's been used by NGOs or by donors like DFAT and others to basically mean the local actors that we're going to employ or subcontract or support to undertake the work to solve the problem as we've defined it with the resources that we're going to give them. So you have big NGOs that have local partners in country. Oxfam would work with local CSO. You'll have some NGOs that have their own local chapters. CARE will have local CARES, or Save the Children would have a local Save the Children chapter in a country. DFID would work through local institutions, its own local office, and then they'd employ local organisations. And people talk about these being partners. And what they basically have meant in a very traditional sense is they're the ones who do the work based on our design, our resources, our ideas. And we'll collaborate and we'll listen to them and everything, but if you like, they're our implementing arm. Now, there's been a bit of work, including some of the research we've done at the Institute here at La Trobe, to really say that notion of partnership is just so inadequate to how we understand change and problems in the world. And we really need to think about how to move from partnerships to a situation where we're working in solidarity and in connection with a whole range of brokers and so on. We need to start from a whole different set of points. So we need to be technically feasible, we need to know what we're doing, but we also need to be politically wise. So how do we find people that we can work with to understand how culture, power and other differences operate in this situation? We need to listen to the voice and the control, or hand over the control to local people, because they're going to develop the solutions. So how do we do that? We need to make sure that we have a wide range of difference and diversity here so that we can see the problem and the issue from different perspectives. We see it from a very privileged perspective, and often the people that we immediately work with who speak our language or understand how to relate to us and so on, they also work from a fairly privileged perspective. What about the people who are most excluded and their perspective on this? How do we include everyone as a strategy to understand things? How do we make sure there's learning space? How do we keep ourselves modest and open to surprise so that we're not trying to take the lead? How do we communicate? But most importantly, how do we build these coalitions and connections that make all of this possible? So there's really two ways that there's been quite a lot of study and thought about that contribute to this notion of working with others for change. One is this notion of social movements, and the women's movement obviously has brought us a lot of learning and a lot of examples and theoretical depth around how movements engage in social change and what we might do. And I guess there's a couple of key elements to this, is that the struggle or the movement is adapted to context, but also the people themselves, in this case the women, actually have to take control and define what happens and what the outcomes are. Now, there's a lot of positives in this. You get citizen participation, you get contestation and debate and engagement through citizens, and if that goes well, then that leads to greater accountability and greater engagement in terms of then trying to influence upwards and so on. Of course, there are challenges in social movements. You can replicate the same inequalities that you get anywhere else if you're not thinking about power and issues. But it's when you've got the best of both worlds that you get the best outcomes from social movements. That's what all the research shows us, which is when you get citizen participation, which is democratic and open and addressing power differences, and it's able to actually coincide or connect with the more formal governance systems in a country. So where there's a place for dissent and change to go, then you're most likely to have the most effective change. And that's been particularly evident in the women's movement. So some of the most significant change for women internationally has been where locally organised women's movements have worked on legislation and political power over time in such a way that they've changed and shifted some of that power based on local women's needs and issues and concerns, and it's actually resulted in change that has been empowering and sustained for women in giving them more control and more space in their lives. So this notion that social movements, which, if you like, are not under our control as outsiders, there are still elements that need to be shaped within those social movements so that they're more likely to lead to more effective control. And so the challenge for us as outsiders working in a change situation is how do you influence social movements towards democratic processes and opportunities for engagement with the formal processes, such as they are. The other way that people talk about coming together is in coalitions. And certainly the Developmental Leadership Program and the Thinking and Working Politically group have particularly focused on this notion of coalitions and how you bring people together to solve collective action problems. So there's a number of rules, I won't go through them all, a number of ideas that have come out of the DLP work around what makes for effective coalitions. But I guess there's a couple of things that stand out to me. One is coalitions are not necessarily homogenous shared value groups. Coalitions can be made up of all sorts of different people with different interests and different values who come together because around this problem and this issue they want to work and make a change. So you can end up with very strange bedfellows. But the evidence shows that provided everyone's clear about what their common interest is around this issue, and there are enough rules that people's values are not totally trampled or ignored, coalitions of different people can work together, and often very effectively, because they can come at problems from different perspectives, and also they can bring different strengths and different opportunities to a particular problem. At the same time, coalitions are fluid, they grow, they change, and often they stop once the problem's solved. So they're not ongoing social movements, they're not ongoing committees or long-term support groups or ongoing organisations. They come together to solve and to address an issue based on those shared interests and common definition of the problem. And again, for an outsider, that's really interesting. So how do outsiders work in ways that might facilitate a coalition coming together to work on a problem without trying to give it form or function that it can't have or that it won't have in the long term? And I guess one of the challenges when you're working in aid and development is if we accept this assumption that the only way we're going to start making a difference to some of the complex problems that we're trying to address is by working with others, is by engaging with people who are interested in change, whether they be themselves committed in social movements to long-term change or whether they have more short-term interests around making something happen. How do we do that as outsiders in ways that get the best diversity, inclusion, ideas, players in there? How do we broker and convene those sort of situations, understanding that they're not going to be completely in our control? And then how do we communicate that to the people who might fund us or support us or donate to us? And how do we report and explain that? So there's some of the challenges around actually making this happen.